Thank you, Aaron. Thanks, everybody, for being here to hear what we've got going on in the aquaculture world. Stupid question. Which button do I push? The big green one?
Oh, sorry, yeah, the big green one's
The most obvious one? Okay. So, yeah, my name's Emma and I'm from Select Oyster Company and my role there is Operations Manager. And I'm going to talk today about boosting Sydney rock oyster production through an industry-owned selective breeding program. So in Australia, the edible oyster industry consists primarily of three species. We have the Pacific oyster, Chrysostria gigas, Sydney rock oyster, Sarcostria glomerata, and the native flat oyster, which is Ostrea angazi. In New South Wales, all three of these species are farmed. Sydney rock oyster is the most predominant species. The other two aren't farmed in as high in numbers. Pacific oysters and angazi in South Australia, Pacific oysters and angazi in Tasmania as well. Again, with both those states, it's the Pacific oyster that's the most intensively farmed there. And there is a small flat oyster, or I should say angazi oyster industry in Victoria. Collectively, the farm gate value of these species across the country is $95 million per year. And what I'm going to talk about today is the Sydney rock oyster. This is I'm biased, but it's my favourite. Last night at the dinner, we were presented with both. I thought they were absolutely beautiful, and I hope you enjoyed them as well. But I'm always going to have a soft spot for the Sydney rock oyster. So the Sydney rock oyster is farmed throughout New South Wales, from Moreton Bay up in Queensland down to the border with Victoria. It's the largest aquaculture industry in the state, and it's the sixth largest aquaculture industry in Australia. There are 32 estuaries and over 300 businesses in New South Wales that farm the Sydney rock oyster, and this accounts for 32% of New South Wales commercial fisheries production. It's a variable industry depending on which estuary you farm in. However, it generates about $8,000 to $35,000 in revenue per hectare. So there is a lot of variability due to the different conditions in the different estuaries and the markets that they attract. There are 16 estuary-wide environmental management systems in place. So this is just a bit of a flag. I'm trying to toot that the promotional horn in that the industry is very environmentally sustainable, and the farmers are champions of their environments. The species is very abundant up and down the state. It's native and it's an iconic species, and that's another selling point of the Sydney rock oyster is its heritage and the fact that it is so iconic and it's only found in this part of the world. But despite the good news, production has been in decline over the past 4 decades or so. So in the mid-70s, it reached its peak at 17 million dozen tonnes per year, $105 million per year. Today, unfortunately, that's dropped down to 5 million dozen tonnes per year and $36.8 million. When I look at this, you can see the trend there of the decline. It's not the best news story. However, I just see a massive potential for growth there. If the oysters existed and were farmed there once before, obviously that can be done again. And I'll go into a few reasons as to why the production has declined and what we're doing to manage it. So the biggest cause for decline are diseases. We've got two bad diseases in New South Wales. QX disease, caused by a parasite, Martellia sydneyi. It's found pretty much north of Sydney is its geographical boundary. In 1994, it hit the Georges River, which is here in Sydney, and in 2004, it hit the Hawkesbury River just north of here. A few other rivers up and down north of here experience the disease, but it's a lot less prolific and it's a lot less regular. However, these two estuaries close to Sydney are the ones that experience it every year without fail, and the hits are pretty hard. POMS herpes virus was found in 2010 in the Georges River and 2013 in the Hawkesbury, and these were catastrophic losses. The POMS virus affects the Pacific oyster, and the QX virus affects the Sydney rock oyster only. I should have said that. And so what these viruses have done is cause closures. So highway oyster farming used to be a really regular thing. Farmers would take oysters up and down the state, and they would have leases in various estuaries because some leases are excellent for catching spat, whereas others are great for fattening it up. So they could really take advantage of natural conditions. With more prolific diseases and issues like this coming into play, it just restricts that movement, and in turn it restricts production. There are also environmental perturbations and floods, for example, and climate change and biotoxins and things that enter the water that also halt production. So what are we doing to combat these problems? Well, there's a lot of things going on in the industry now, very positive things. The talks that we've seen this morning about oyster farm management tools, and there's a lot of great marketing strategies coming into the industry as well, and newer people coming into the industry. So I see a lot of positivity for the future. But what I'm going to talk about is the selective breeding program, because this is one very important strategy of many that the industry is adopting now to try and combat these production declines. So the breeding program started in 1990 by the Department of Primary Industries, and that started as a mass selection program. This photo here that you can see, these oysters were deployed in Port Stephens and the Georges River to begin with. The photo here that you can see is the result of an exposure trial of a mass selection selected year class, we would call it, or generation. So the top tray is non-disease resistant oysters where they've experienced about 90% mortality. The bottom tray is a disease resistant line where they've only experienced about 10% mortality. We've also seen a massive increase in growth, so we've been selectively breeding for fast growth, and that's accelerated growth by about 30%. The papers that we've produced demonstrate that QX disease resistance has increased survival to 83% versus 5%. Winter mortality disease, that's a disease, there's a lot less known about that one, and that occurs in the southern parts of the state, typically during winter, as the name would suggest, and we're also selectively breeding for resistance to that. The survival there has been about 70% versus 48% for a non-selected control oyster. But there are limitations with this type of mass selection breeding, such as inbreeding risks, which grow generation upon generation. We don't have heritability information on these animals, and there are trade-offs between traits. So if you select for fast growth, you're probably going to be reducing your quality of meat. It's a biological trade-off, and we couldn't quantify these trade-offs with the mass selection program. So what mass selection is basically you would select the survivors or the largest animals from a cohort and then just reproduce from them, and every year you carry on doing the same thing. So it's worked up until just recently. The mass selection program has brought us some excellent achievements, but what we're doing now is moving into a family breeding program. So this is a full sibling multi-trait pedigree program, and the photo here, you can't see much of a difference between each of those families of oysters, but we need to keep the genetic integrity very sound. Each family of oyster is kept separate from the next, and we can breed each of those families knowing what their pedigree information is, what their heritability information is, what the EBVs are. We started this in 2005, and back in 2005, 7 families were produced. Last year, 68 families were produced. So every year we're adding on more and more families to the reservoir or the gene pool of families. And the goal is for 80 families in each year class. And again, I should reiterate that the Department of Primary Industries in Port Stephens, the Fisheries Department, they're breeding these oysters every year, and they're the ones that are the real drivers behind this. Each of the families from each year class undergoes 8 progeny tests for spat, or the juvenile oyster, and the adult oyster for each year class. And I'm basically just demonstrating here how much effort is actually going into trying to get the best possible genetic information we can from these animals. With the family breeding program, we're combating those challenges that I mentioned with mass selection. So we know what the heritabilities are, we know what the pedigree is of every family, and we know where any inbreeding lies, so we can completely control for that, whereas with the old program we couldn't do that. The industry priorities and what we're selecting these families for predominantly are fast growth, QX disease and winter mortality disease resistant oysters, and meat condition. There is a Pacific oyster breeding program going on simultaneously, run by a company called Australian Seafood Industries in Tasmania, and they're also making similar gains in POMS resistance through a family breeding program. So where do we have our progeny trials? We have oysters deployed in north in Clarence River and in the Georges River here in Sydney to test for QX disease resistance. We have oysters deployed in the centre of the state, Wallace Lake and Port Stephens, and on the south part of New South Wales, where Ewan and Phil have come from, testing for meat condition, growth and shell shape. And then we deploy the families in the Georges River and on the south of the state again for testing for winter mortality disease resistance. So yeah, it's an extensive program. This graph here is to show you what kind of data we're getting from this. Now, this is an estimated breeding value graph. So on the y-axis, we can see an estimated breeding value, an EBV. Basically, this is telling us how great these oysters are in terms of certain traits. The top graph is QX disease resistance. So the steeper the gradient is an indication of how heritable these traits are. So QX disease resistance, we've discovered in just a few year classes, is a highly heritable trait. And we can already isolate some of the strongest families we have in the mix, those ones that are shaded green there, some of our best performing families for QX disease resistance. We can turn to those in the future and then incorporate them into the next year class of families, and that estimated breeding value will only get stronger. Weight and growth is a heritable trait as well, not as heritable as QX disease resistance. And condition again. So condition is a tough one. We know it's heritable, but there are a lot of there's a lot of variables involved with condition, primarily environmental variables. So we're still working on trying to make that slope a little steeper, and that way we'll know that condition is going to be even more heritable trait. So the take-home message from this is that the science is working. We're really, really pleased with the science of this breeding program. It's going a bull at a gate, and it's a good news story. But what about the commercialisation of this program? That's very important, or else we're not really providing for the industry if this cannot be uptaken by the farmers. So this is where Select Oyster Company comes in. So we're an industry-owned company. We were set up in 2004 by the industry, for the industry. So our shareholders are industry. We're administered by the New South Wales Farmers Association, and the Department of Primary Industries in Port Stephens are our operational breeder, and they're the research and the minds behind all of this. They've been driving the breeding program since 1990. And over the years, we've had a lot of wonderful, generous contribution from funding bodies, FRDC, CSIRO, where our geneticists are based. The Australian Government and the Seafood CRCP is a recent program launched to investigate more about the genetics and the breeding program. The New South Wales Local Land Services, Oysters Australia, and Australian Seafood, the Australian Seafood Corporation Cooperative Research Centre, which is no longer around. But again, without the help of these bodies, these funding bodies, the Select Oyster Company would not be where it is today. So the bottom line there is that the commercialisation of this program is the tricky part, because we're still not at a stage where we can independently walk away from the funding bodies and provide a selectively bred oyster for the industry. But we're working on it. So brood stock is our business. So this is the chain of events, really. So we have the brood stock that we have exposed to a disease or we've selected for fast growth, for example. We provide it to a commercial hatchery. They undergo a spawning process that then moves the larvae grow into spat, which goes into a nursery, and then ultimately that ends up in the hands of the growers on the farm. So we don't own a hatchery or a nursery ourselves. We're not farmers, but we provide them with the genetic material. We manage this broodstock in 7 estuaries in New South Wales, and this reduces our risk of any closures, and it gives us more access to more stock, and we can take advantage of better environmental conditions given the time of year. We provide the broodstock on request to the hatcheries, and we use tailored and guided selection of broodstock based on estimated breeding values and guidance from CSIRO, and inbreeding coefficients, of course. We generate a levy on any spat that's sold to the grower at the end of the day. We take home a small levy of 0.3 cents per oyster. So that's how our business works. The current This was a survey we did of the industry last year. So this survey represents about 16% of the growers in New South Wales. So it's a conservative estimate, and through word of mouth, I believe actually that these figures are a lot higher. But what we've documented is that the current demand for Sydney rock oyster spat is 33.8 million seed or spat per year. This is about 400% lower than, our production is about 400% lower than what the demand is asking. So customers are not an issue. The industry would love to get more of the selected lines of seed, but production is the biggest problem. So why is production such a problem? The selected lines are 100% reliant on hatcheries, commercial hatcheries. The hatchery seed provides the minority of the total harvest in the state, about 20%. And we think that there's some problems in hatchery production as due to technical difficulties. It's still quite I guess you could say, a new technology, and there aren't a huge amount of hatcheries in the state to supply just yet. Hatchery production is also very dependent on broodstock conditions, so there's a lot of research going into how we can improve broodstock condition, but still, again, it's another technical difficulty that we're trying to address so that hatcheries, the wheels can be turning and they can just be flowing like water. A land-based nursery is also required, which is not a deal breaker, but it does add another step to the process. And there is farmer hesitation due to the unreliability of the supply. So if we can't supply, farmers tend to, they wouldn't put in an order. They would prefer to just go out and catch their own wild seed because it's far more convenient than rushing around trying to find the spat that is available. So there's currently 2 commercial hatcheries in New South Wales, one in Queensland, one in Victoria, and there's one in WA that we hope to start doing business with very shortly to boost our supply. There's also this perception among the industry that spat, or juvenile oysters, is expensive. And that's not the case at all. I'm going to show you on the next slide, a study was done very recently about the difference in cost between actually purchasing spat from a hatchery or catching your own. It came up with some interesting figures. But overall, the hatchery production cycle takes about 21 days in a perfect world. It normally stretches out to a little bit longer than that. The oysters spend a few months in the nursery and then they go to the farm and they're harvested in about 18 to 20 months for the selectively bred fast-growing stock. Further to our challenges, wild seed is the majority, or 80% of the total harvest that is in the state today. It's not reliant on hatcheries. Farmers lay what we call plastic slats. It used to be wooden sticks, but they lay slats out in the estuaries in parts where wild seed is abundant. The spats settle on the slats and then they can strip them a few months later. And this normally happens in the summer to autumn months when they're catching. There is this perception that spat is free. If you do it this way, you're catching wild seed. It doesn't cost you anything. But like I was saying before, we just did a recent study of this. It's about $40,000 cheaper per year to actually purchase spat from a hatchery because you're not dealing with the time and the staff hours required that go into laying slats and stripping them. Another great benefit of ordering seed from a hatchery is that it's very quantifiable. You order this many million, that many million come. Then you can say to a bank or whoever, if you're looking for a loan or if you want to quantify the value of your farm, it's much easier. It's hard to quantify what you're actually selling when you're catching it from the wild. So what are Select Oyster Company priorities now? We need to boost the spat supply to the industry. We need to improve the reliability and the consistency of this supply. And we need to improve the industry, hatchery, nursery communications for more, like a purchasing ease, we'll call it. Again, if you're going to pick up the phone and you can't actually get what you ordered, it creates a lot of, people get annoyed and they just would give up on it. So we need to close those gaps. We'd like to continue extension and training programs for better hatchery technology, and that's what we're working on with a lot of help from our funding bodies as well. And we're always promoting the product, and the product gets better and better every year class. So that's actually an easy sale. And we're trying to debunk the perception of free wild seed and identify costs of the program. All these things tie in together to help us boost the production and the supply to the industry. Ultimately, the commercial viability of the Sydney rock oyster breeding program is our goal. At the end of the day, though, and we've talked about this a lot this conference, what really matters is the people that are involved in the industry. So these are the farmers, the ones that love the product but just can't get enough of it. And there's a lot of other farmers there that would love to try the product, but they're just struggling to get access to it, or they just haven't got the experience with it just yet. But like I said, it was an easy sale. The product is fabulous, and these are the people that, at the end of the day, matter the most. So thank you for listening. Got my contact details there, and I'd love to speak with you further and have a chat over lunch. Oh, okay, yeah, I will. Have I got a minute?
Yeah.
Very good. There's somebody in the audience, Todd. Todd has been working on the breeding program with us voluntarily, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So, Todd, can you stand up? He's a farmer from Macleay, which is about, 5-6 hours north of here, Todd? Yeah, and about a year ago, we put a call out to some farmers and industry, anyone in the industry really, to say if you want to help out with the breeding program and learn about the genetics behind it, give us a shout. So Todd put his hand up for that, and it's been amazing. And we have somebody else on board too, working with us, a guy called Mitch, but he's not here today. But yeah, big thanks for all your help, Todd.